Welcome to Equip, Build, and Mature. As I like to do on Saturdays, I want to do an overview of one of the books of the Bible. And today we'll be looking at 1 Timothy. So, the first of 5 questions I like to ask the documents. Who wrote this document? Well, 1 Timothy is the first of Paul's final series of personal letters, including 2 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. 1 Timothy offers personal and practical advice from the aging Apostle Paul to the young servant of God's Word, Timothy. He was sharing God's truth with Jesus' disciples at the city of Ephesus. At least 10 years before Paul wrote this letter, he first met Timothy in Timothy's hometown of Lystra. That's in Asia Minor. At Lystra, Timothy was known and respected by Jesus' covenant disciples. You see this in Acts chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. And Paul quickly noticed Timothy's godly qualities. So Paul recruited the young man to travel with him as he continued his second mission journey. Timothy's presence filled a very important need for the Apostle Paul. They became fellow workers and travel partners after Paul separated from Barnabas, because Barnabas had been Paul's mentor, encourager, and fellow worker in Jesus' mission. We see this in Acts chapter 15, verses 36 to 41. So what time in history does this all take place? Well, God in his written word is silent about Paul's final outcome. Scholars and exegetes have made some assumptions. The book of Acts ends with Paul in Rome as a prisoner. He's waiting for his trial before the Roman emperor. Each Roman citizen, of which Paul was one, they had the privilege of an appeal. So these personal letters of Paul are clearly dated at the time after the events of the book of Acts. Where was Paul when he wrote 1 Timothy? Well, Paul had expected the Romans to release him from prison, and that probably happened near the end of AD 62. We gather this from Philippians chapter 2, verse 24. And after he was released, he was able to travel to the city of Ephesus. And eventually, he arranged for Timothy to share God's truth with Jesus' disciples at Ephesus. And that enabled Paul to go to Macedonia to preach God's word there. So while Paul was in Macedonia, he received reports of Timothy's work at Ephesus. And that is what prompted him to write 1 Timothy, probably in AD 63. So why is 1 Timothy so important? Well, this letter presents the clearest and most complete teachings in the New Testament for how to be a leader in Jesus' church and how a congregation of Jesus' disciples are to function effectively and organically as they reflect the image of God's nature. So this includes sections on appropriate conduct as Jesus' disciples gather to worship God. Also, the godlike qualities of spiritual shepherds and spiritual servants. And also we see the proper approach to deal with spiritual discipline within a community of faith. Paul advised Timothy on these very practical issues, and he did it in a way that helped this young leader as he shared God's truth among Jesus' disciples. Paul emphasized the purity that leaders among Jesus' disciples should have and their responsibility to make certain that as Jesus' disciples gather to worship God, they do it reverently and without chaos or arrogance. So what is the big idea in this letter? Timothy's younger age really was a great blessing. Part of that blessing of his youth was having the energy and the stamina that's needed to share God's truth to Jesus' covenant disciples. His younger age also caused expected problems with older disciples who were spiritually immature. They were reluctant to think that a young man could be an effective leader because they assumed that he lacked the needed knowledge and he lacked the needed experience. But it was very important to the Apostle Paul for Timothy to be an example of consistent faith and a good conscience. Timothy needed to remain free of accusation and to use the spiritual capabilities that God had blessed him with. We see this in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 12 to 16. Paul knew that the responsibility of sharing God's truth would be a very difficult challenge for this young man. And that is why, 2 different times throughout this letter, Paul encouraged Timothy to fight the good fight. Chapter 1, verse 18, and chapter 6, verse 12. To persevere in what was good was a daily struggle for Timothy. Perseverance requires thick skin, a clear purpose, and a tender, compassionate heart filled with grace and mercy. So how does this document apply to you and me today in 2026? Well, true spiritual leaders of Jesus' church, they have great responsibilities in their places of service. That's the key. They're servants. They are part of God's design to encourage, not demand, but encourage the spiritual growth of God's redeemed sheep. We know the significance of servant leaders and servants of the word in Jesus' church and in our personal lives. But 1 Timothy helps us to gain perhaps a clearer understanding of the spiritual qualities and places of service of the various servant leaders in Jesus' church. In this letter, the Apostle Paul logically explained what he hoped Timothy would do using his God-given capabilities in that place of service in Ephesus. So this provides us with a guide for the qualities and places of service that our servant leaders need to have and must follow even today. So do the leaders that you have observed fully follow the teachings of Paul in his first letter to young Timothy? Jesus' church only functions properly as an organic reflection of the spiritual reality of God's image. And that can only happen when and if we follow fully the biblical guide that God has revealed to us through his apostle Paul. Each community of disciples that is serious about following Jesus and being like him, they must make certain that their leaders are servants, not bosses, not commanders, not dictators, not people who think they're telling. They're people that need to be doing, to serve God's people. They're not to be bosses. Do they have spiritual priorities that reflect the priorities of God? Jesus' servant leaders emphasize sound doctrine, purity in their personal moral lives, and being a sincere, pure example of reflecting Jesus. If those that claim to be leaders do not have these qualities, then you will not find Jesus' church. You will have a man-made religious organization created in the image of your human leaders. We must make the godly choice, not the convenient choice or the easy choice. Thanks, guys, for spending a few minutes with me here today. Hope you have a great Saturday, and may God continue to bless us as we seek to do his will and only his will. Take care.